You're listening to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian, where history drifts like candle smoke through quiet rooms. If you're listening at night, the world outside may already be dark and still. Maybe there's a soft hum of traffic somewhere, or the faint rhythm of a ceiling fan. So breathe in and breathe out. Let your shoulders drop. You don't have to remember anything tonight. Just listen and let time slow down. Tonight, we'll follow a trail of smoke, a green thread winding through ancient places. Long before the word weed existed, people were already lighting little bundles of dried cannabis leaves, watching them glow, and wondering why the world suddenly felt softer, slower, or somehow closer to the divine. Where did that first moment happen? In what forgotten valley, or under what starlit tent, did someone first exhale and watch the night shimmer just slightly differently? Let's go there slowly. Our story begins on the endless grasslands of Central Asia, thousands of years ago, in a place without borders, only wind. The steppe stretched from the Black Sea all the way to Mongolia, and in the middle of that great openness lived nomadic tribes, herders, riders, people who followed their animals rather than cities. The air was dry. The sky was enormous. And in the evenings, when the fires burned low, someone might have tossed a handful of unfamiliar leaves into the embers. And noticed the way the smoke carried a strangely sweet scent. Archaeologists have found their traces, not stories written down, but things buried in the cold soil. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, tombs from nearly 2,500 years ago have been uncovered, sealed in permafrost. Inside, in the graves of Scythian nobles, there were golden bowls still dusted with burnt cannabis. Nearby, small bronze burners were found, blackened from use. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote of these same nomads in the 5th century BC. They throw hemp seed upon the red-hot stones, and immediately it smokes, and gives out such a vapor as no Greek vapor bath can surpass. The Scythians, delighted, shout for joy. It's one of the oldest written records of humans deliberately inhaling cannabis smoke. Imagine that, a circle of tents on the steppe, a cold wind, and inside one of them, the air thick and fragrant with burning herbs. No music, perhaps? Just the creak of leather, the crack of the fire, and the quiet laughter of people drifting in and out of something dreamlike. They didn't think of it as getting high. They thought of it as something holy. A bridge to ancestors. A conversation with invisible worlds. In many early societies, smoke itself was sacred, the thing that rose toward the gods. And here, that rising column of scent and warmth was more than just ritual. It was the beginning of a relationship that would stretch across continents and centuries. Outside, beyond the tent flap, the steppe wind went on whispering across the grass. Long after those Scythian fires dimmed, the knowledge of cannabis traveled, carried in pouches and stories by traders, healers, and wandering mystics. It appeared quietly in the medical scrolls of the ancient world. In China, around 2700 BC, legend says the mythical emperor Shen Nung tested hundreds of plants upon himself to learn their properties. Among them was ma, the hemp plant. It was used to ease pain, to calm spasms, to make childbirth gentler. There is no sign that the Chinese smoked it. They brewed it, they crushed its seeds, they mixed its resin into oils. But still, they knew it altered the mind. And in a culture that prized balance between yin and yang, the plant's dual nature, calming yet stirring, cooling yet burning, was both mystery and medicine. To the south, in India, cannabis found an entirely different identity. It became part of religion. In Sanskrit texts, it was called bhang, ganja, and charas, each form slightly different, each with its own ritual. The Atharva Veda, one of India's oldest sacred books, names cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants, calling it a source of happiness, a liberator. People did not merely consume it, they offered it, to Shiva, to the gods, to one another. And in those early centuries, while China valued it as a healer, and India saw it as a divine companion, the idea of smoking it began to take hold. Not with pipes, not yet, but with glowing embers, a rolled leaf, a breath taken deep into the lungs. The act itself became prayerful, the inhalation a drawing in of sacred essence, the exhalation a release of self. In the corners of ancient courtyards, the scent of burning bhang would drift up, mingling with the sound of bells, the low chanting of mantras, and the rustle of silk. And in the background, the oil lamps flickered softly. Far to the west, along the slow curve of the Nile, the Egyptians also knew the plant. Their papyri mention hemp fibers, and their temples hold images of the goddess Seshet, often crowned with what some believe to be cannabis leaves. They used it for rope, for medicine, for ritual incense. But whether the Egyptians smoked it remains debated. Some mummified remains show traces of cannabinoids, though scholars argue about contamination, about the ages between use and discovery. Still, one can imagine the air inside a temple of Thebes, heavy with frankincense and myrrh, and perhaps, just perhaps, something else. A sweeter smoke curling from clay bowls, rising toward painted ceilings filled with stars. Priests inhaling deeply before speaking oracles. Healers mixing oils for sacred anointing. And in that hazy light, the line between medicine, spirit, and pleasure blurred, as it so often did in the ancient world. Outside, the Nile rolled on, carrying its slow moonlit reflections downstream. And in the background, the cicadas hummed in the reeds. From the banks of the Nile, our quiet trail drifts eastward again, across the shifting deserts, over salt plains and mountain passes, toward the ancient Persian heartlands. Here, long before cities like Tehran or Shiraz took their names, empires rose out of the dust like mirages. The air shimmered with heat by day, and by night, the stars came close enough to touch. In these highlands, where Zoroastrian fire temples glowed against the horizon, the rituals of smoke were already deeply woven into belief. Fire was divine. Smoke was its messenger. The Persians burned herbs and woods as offerings, halma, ephedra, and perhaps, those scholars still argue, cannabis. The Avesta, their sacred scripture, speaks of plants that bring delight to the spirit. It is possible, quietly possible, that among them was the green resin gathered from wild hemp growing along the Caspian plains. The Persians valued stillness of mind, a bridge between matter and the sacred. And so, within those ancient temples, one might imagine the priests feeding handfuls of fragrant leaves into a glowing censer, their faces lit by flickering amber light. Later, under the Achaemenid kings, contact with the Scythians deepened. They were the same nomads Herodotus had described, people who already burned hemp for joy. Trade routes ran thick between them, carrying horses, spices, silk, and sometimes, things less visible, songs, beliefs, habits of intoxication. In the Persian royal gardens, the paradisa, which gave us our word paradise, visitors spoke of shaded pavilions filled with perfumes and music. And in the corners, far from the formal halls, small gatherings would sit with bowls of burning herbs, sharing stories while the smoke rose in lazy curls through lattice windows. A whisper of laughter, a half-remembered poem, a shared glance, all softened by the same sweet cloud that had once drifted across the steppe. The Persians were also among the first to distill and study scent scientifically. They called it attar, the soul of flowers. And to them, smoke was another attar, fleeting, invisible, yet powerful. It could cleanse, charm, intoxicate, and connect. Over centuries, the Persian world would give rise to new faiths, new languages, new ways of seeing the unseen. And as trade continued, so too did this plant's quiet journey, carried east and west along the Silk Road, tucked into leather bags beside saffron and tea. By night, when the desert winds cooled and the tents glowed from within, travelers might share a small ember, passing it hand to hand, not as a vice, but as a moment of fellowship. One flame, one bowl, one breath. And somewhere in the distance, the camels grumbled softly against the starlit dunes. And in the background, the fire hissed and whispered. By the early medieval centuries, the world had changed again. Persia's empires had given way to Islam, and a new kind of spirituality swept across the deserts and ports. But even within the strict boundaries of religion, there were always those who sought the divine in different ways. The Sufis, Islamic mystics, believed in dhikr, the remembrance of God through music, poetry, and trance. They turned in slow circles under the moon, they chanted, they wept, they danced. And sometimes, quietly, they used a little something to help them reach that still point within the storm. Early chronicles describe Sufi mystics in Persia, Afghanistan, and India consuming a resin they called hashish, drawn from the flowering tops of the cannabis plant. Unlike smoke drifting upward, hashish was eaten, chewed, or dissolved in honey. It did not burn, it bloomed. And its effects, they said, brought the soul closer to light. In medieval cities like Baghdad or Damascus, the scent of spices, ink, and parchment filled the streets. Coffee had not yet arrived, but tea and sweet sherbets were shared among poets. In hidden courtyards, men in woolen robes recited verses of Rumi and Hafiz, words that turned love into theology. Sometimes, after hours of chanting, a small pellet of hashish was passed from palm to palm, a greenish sweetness that melted on the tongue. The authorities disapproved, of course. The use of hashish became a moral question, a test of piety. But to the Sufis, what mattered was intention. If the plant led to sloth, it was sin. If it led to awakening, it was a gift. In the Persian tongue, there was a word, mast. It meant intoxicated, but also enraptured, lost in love. And so, when Sufis spoke of the green intoxication, they weren't speaking of vice, they were speaking of surrender, of letting go of the self, as one lets smoke dissolve into air. In their gatherings, the night would stretch long. A reed flute sighed, a drum murmured, sandals scuffed the dust as they turned. And above them, the stars watched silently, patient witnesses to yet another form of prayer. Outside, the streets of Baghdad quieted, the markets closed, and the river shimmered like black silk under the crescent moon. And in the background, the drumbeats slowed to a heartbeat's rhythm. As the centuries turned, the plant continued its patient migration. From Arabia, it crossed the Red Sea, riding the sails of dhows to the eastern shores of Africa, to ports like Mombasa, Lamu, and Zanzibar. Here, the air was thick with the scent of salt and clove. Caravans came down from the highlands with ivory and gold, and traders from across the Indian Ocean brought porcelain, spices, and seeds. Among them, quietly, came cannabis. On the Swahili coast, it found new soil, sandy, humid, generous. It was cultivated in small patches beside millet and coconuts, often hidden among taller plants. People here didn't write of it in texts or law codes. They simply used it, as they did so many herbs, for healing and for song. By the 14th century, Arab chroniclers noted its presence deep inland, among the Bantu-speaking peoples, the Nilotic tribes, even the forest dwellers beyond the Great Lakes. Everywhere it went, it adapted to the rhythm of local life. In Ethiopia, it became part of spiritual healing. In Congo, it was smoked before battle, believed to lend courage. In Madagascar, it was used to speak with ancestors, the smoke curling toward the sky like a question. Unlike alcohol, which dulled the body, cannabis seemed to open it. It made conversation slow, laughter deep, reflection long. It helped the body work longer under the sun, the mind drift gently during song. And in the evenings, as the drums echoed across the villages and firelight shimmered on dark faces, someone would pass a small clay pipe, its ember glowing like a star. Africa became one of the plant's great crossroads. Later, when the ships of empire came, Portuguese, Dutch, British, they would find it already rooted, already sacred. And though those colonizers tried to forbid it, they could never erase its smell from the wind. The ocean rolled on endlessly beyond the reefs. And in the background, the waves murmured against the shore. When cannabis finally reached Europe, it came not as smoke, but as fiber. For centuries, Europeans knew hemp only as rope and sailcloth, the backbone of their ships, their rigging, their naval empires. A single vessel could require more than 50 tons of hemp rope. But there were always sailors who learned more about the plant than the admirals ever suspected. Along the docks of Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Marseille, men from Africa and the East shared rolled leaves, tiny pipes, stories of kif, and ganja. By the 18th century, European explorers in Asia and Africa began to write of it, not judgmentally at first, but with curiosity. Napoleon's soldiers, when they invaded Egypt in 1798, found the locals enjoying small balls of hashish and infusions of cannabis tea. Alcohol was banned in the Muslim world, but this, they noticed, was tolerated. When the army returned to France, they brought samples. Parisian bohemians soon formed the Club de Hashishans, where writers like Baudelaire and Gautier experimented with cannabis confections, describing sensations of timelessness, color, and sound. It was fashionable, fleetingly, part of the Romantic movement's fascination with the exotic. But in Europe, smoke was still associated with fire and factory, not with dream or ritual. The plant would remain marginal, misunderstood, quietly waiting for the new world to take its next breath. In the drawing rooms of Paris, the lamps burned low, music floated from another room, and in the background, the city slept under a thin veil of rain. The Americas met cannabis not once, but twice. The first came with the Spanish in the 1500s, who carried hemp seeds for rope-making in their colonial outposts. The second came with the enslaved Africans, who carried not seeds, but memory, the ritual knowledge of smoke and leaf. On Caribbean islands like Jamaica, cannabis found its home in fertile soil and warm rain. It became ganja, blending African tradition with Indian laborers' customs under British rule. It was used in medicine, in music, in the quiet rebellion of the poor. By the 19th century, in Mexico and the southern United States, marijuana entered the vocabulary, a word whispered in border towns long before it became political. Doctors prescribed tinctures for pain and insomnia. Apothecaries kept it beside laudanum and opium. No one yet called it a crime. It was simply another plant in humanity's long cabinet of curiosities. In the sugar fields, in the jazz clubs, in the quiet courtyards of Veracruz, smoke drifted up once more, the same old ritual in new hands. Different languages, same exhale. Outside, night frogs sang near the canals, and in the background, the crickets kept time with the breeze. The 20th century brought new anxieties. Empires collapsed, new nations rose, and with them came laws, borders, fears. What had once been sacred or medicinal was reimagined as threat. In America, newspapers ran strange stories of reefer madness, of foreign menace. Cannabis became tangled in politics and prejudice, its long, complex past reduced to caricature. By the 1930s, most Western countries had outlawed it. But history does not forget so easily. The plant persisted in corners, in music, art, poetry, the quiet spaces where people seek peace. It traveled with soldiers to Vietnam, with musicians to Woodstock, with thinkers to quiet rooms filled with incense and jazz. Each generation rediscovered what the Scythians, the Sufis, the monks, and the healers had known, that smoke can be both prayer and pause. The world grew louder, faster. But still, here and there, a curl of sweet, slow smoke rose from a back porch or a candlelit room, reminding humanity of its ancient breath. And in the background, the records spun softly on. Now, in our own time, the story has turned again. Science measures what mystics once felt: cannabinoids, receptors, neurochemistry. Doctors speak where priests once did. But beneath the data, something older still hums. Each time someone lights a small ember and breathes deeply, they join an unbroken chain of seekers. From Scythian tents to Himalayan shrines, from Ethiopian firesides to suburban balconies, the ritual endures. The smoke still rises. It curls toward the ceiling, toward the stars, toward memory. And though the laws, names, and rituals have changed, the essence remains, a moment of slowness in a world that rarely pauses. If you are listening now, eyes half closed, perhaps you can almost see them, those thousands of nights before yours, lit by the same faint glow, warmed by the same plant, softened by the same breath. History, like smoke, is never still. It drifts, it fades, it lingers. And in that lingering, we find connection. So rest now. Let the centuries drift past like clouds over the steppe. The night is deep, the world is ancient, and somewhere far away, the hearth still crackles. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. And so, the story of cannabis, or weed, or bhang, or hemp, is not really about rebellion or law. It is about curiosity, about the human wish to see the world through gentler eyes, to blur the borders between waking and dreaming. From the Scythian steppe to the Ganges, from the tombs of Egypt to the backrooms of jazz clubs, it has always been the same small act: a leaf, a spark, and a breath. So, if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Let the centuries fade. And somewhere, in that deep, ancient stillness, imagine the soft curl of smoke rising, and the night settling around it like a blanket. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.